water. His eyes opened, his lungs seized, his hands shot outward in a reflexive, animal panic, fingers clawing at something solid beneath him. Stone, he thought, or something very much like it. Rough and cold and wet, with a moisture that felt ancient, as though it had been gathering since the beginning of time. He was lying on his back. He did not know where. He did not know how he had come to be lying on his back in a place that smelled like iron and sulfur and something else beneath both of those things, something he could not immediately identify, but that reached down into the most primitive part of his brain and triggered a single, screaming alarm. Wrong. This is wrong. Everything about this is wrong. Kayden sat up. He was 26 years old, though he could not have told you that in this moment. He was 6 feet tall, lean in the way of young men who had once played high school football, and still carried the memory of athleticism in the architecture of their shoulders. He had brown hair, cut short, and green eyes that were currently wide and white-rimmed with a terror so pure it had not yet organized itself into coherent thought. He wore jeans, dark wash, slightly worn at the knees, and a gray t-shirt and white sneakers that were already stained with something dark and wet from the ground beneath him. He sat up and he looked around, and for a long moment, he simply breathed. There was nothing to see. No, that was not quite right. There was something to see. It was just that the something was so overwhelming in its wrongness, so utterly divorced from anything his mind had a template for, that his brain initially refused to process it. It was the way the eye slides off a magic eye puzzle, finding no purchase, no familiar shape to anchor to. His mind kept trying to impose the ordinary, a room, a street, a parking garage, a warehouse, and kept failing, kept sliding, kept retreating in confusion. He was in a place that should not exist. He was in a place that had no name in any language he had ever spoken. He was in hell. He just didn't know it yet. The first thing he established, with the methodical desperation of a man clinging to logic as though it were a life preserver, was that he was in a cavern, or something like a cavern. The ceiling above him was high, impossibly high, vanishing into a darkness so complete it seemed less like an absence of light, more like a presence of something else. Some anti-light that actively consumed illumination, that hungered for it. The walls, where he could make them out, were a deep charcoal gray, veined with something that pulsed a deep, diseased red, the color of infected tissue, the color of embers struggling to stay alive under a dead fire. The floor beneath him was flat and dark and damp, and the moisture on it was cold in a way that went beyond temperature, a cold that felt intentional, as though the ground itself was trying to leach something from him, some warmth, some vitality, some essential human quality he could not afford to lose. The light, such as it was, came from nowhere he could identify. It was a dim, sickly illumination, the color of old bruises, of jaundice, of a sky moments before a tornado. It did not cast shadows so much as it seemed to create them, deepening them, giving them a solidity and presence that shadows should not possess. The shadows in this place moved, not with the fluid confidence of shadows caused by moving light sources. These moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness, like things that breathed, like things that watched, like things that knew he was there and were content, for now, to simply observe. Kayden stood. His legs trembled, but held. He turned in a slow circle, trying to establish the geometry of his surroundings, trying to find walls, trying to find exits, trying to find anything that made sense. The cavern, the space, extended in multiple directions, but not in ways that corresponded to how space was supposed to work. There were openings in the walls that he could not tell whether they were passages or simply deeper darknesses. There were formations of rock. If it was rock, if it was really rock and not something else wearing rock's shape, that rose from the floor in twisted columns, some of them reaching toward the unseeable ceiling like the grasping fingers of enormous, buried hands. And there was sound. The sound was the worst thing. Worse than the sight of it, worse than the smell of it. It was distant, always just far enough away that you could not be certain you were hearing it at all. But it was constant. It was the sound of voices. Not voices speaking words, not voices calling out in any language he knew, but voices in the most fundamental sense. Human sounds, throat sounds, the kind of noise a body makes when it is expressing something that language has given up trying to contain. Pain, fear, something beyond both of those things, something so deep and sustained that the word suffering felt almost inadequate for it. Somewhere, at the edges of his perception, people were suffering, had been suffering for a very long time. Kayden said, "Hello?" The word left his mouth and fell dead almost immediately, swallowed by the air, if it was air, of this place, absorbed without echo, without the acknowledgement that empty spaces normally give to sound. The silence that followed was not a natural silence. It was a silence that was aware of him, a silence that had turned its attention toward him the moment he spoke, the way a predator turns its head at the snap of a twig. He did not speak again. He chose a direction. He chose it the way you choose in nightmares. Not because it was right, not because it made sense, but because standing still felt like the thing that would break him, and moving felt like the only answer available to a body that was wired for survival. He walked toward what seemed like the largest opening in the far wall of the cavern, a dark arch that rose some 12 feet above the floor, its edges rough and uneven and irregular in the way that nature is irregular, or the way that nature is mimicked by something that has studied it but does not quite understand the spirit of it. He walked. The ground was uneven beneath his feet, and he stumbled twice in the first few minutes, his hands shooting out to catch himself against the wall. When his palm pressed against the stone, he felt it, a faint, rhythmic vibration, almost like a pulse, slow and heavy, and very far from anything that could be called healthy. He pulled his hand back as though burned and kept walking, keeping the wall just visible at the edge of his peripheral vision, but refusing to touch it again. As he passed through the great arch, something changed. The air thickened. That was the only way to describe it. The air physically thickened, became harder to pull into his lungs, took on a texture that was almost physical, almost gelatinous, as though breathing here required more effort than breathing had any right to require. His chest labored. His heart rate, already elevated, climbed further. He pressed on, because stopping was not a thing he was prepared to do, because stopping meant accepting this place on its own terms, and he was not ready to do that. He was not ready to believe this was real. Not yet. Not quite yet. He passed through the arch, and the cavern fell away behind him, and he was in a passage, long, low, lit by that same sourceless, jaundiced light. And somewhere in the walls around him, he thought he could hear breathing. Not his own, something else's, something patient. He walked faster. The passage opened eventually into a space so vast that Kayden stopped walking and simply stood for a long moment, trying to take it in. It was a plain, or a landscape that approximated a plain, flat, dark, stretching away in every direction to horizons he could not see. The ground here was different from the cavern behind him, softer in a way that turned out to be more disturbing than the hard stone had been, because the softness had a give to it, a slight yield beneath each step, as though the ground were not entirely solid, as though something just beneath the surface was responding to the weight of him. The sky, if you could call it a sky, was a deep, roiling dark, the color of ink mixed with blood, and it moved with the slow, ponderous churning of a storm system that had been building for centuries. And there were people here. Not many. Not the screaming masses he had half expected, not the tormented crowds of illustrated Bibles and medieval paintings. Just a scattering of figures, dispersed across the plain at wide intervals, standing or sitting or lying down, with the stillness of those who have simply stopped. They did not seem to be in physical agony. They did not writhe or cry out. They simply were in this place, existing in it, with a dull acceptance that was somehow more frightening than any display of pain could have been. Kayden approached the nearest figure. A man, he thought, though the man's features were indistinct in the dim light, softened somehow, as though he were being seen through a smeared window. The man sat on the ground, with his knees drawn to his chest, staring at nothing, his eyes open and fixed on a middle distance that contained only more dark. "Hey," Kayden said. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man's eyes moved. Slowly, with enormous effort, they turned toward Kayden, and in them was an expression Kayden had no ready category for, not quite sadness, not quite despair, something more fundamental than either. Something like the look of a person who had been waiting for a very long time and had finally given up waiting. Not in anger, but in a grief so complete it had consumed even the energy for anger. "Where is this?" Kayden asked. The man opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Not silence, something worse than silence. The attempt at sound, the shape of speech without the substance of it, the movement of lips and tongue forming words that no longer had anywhere to go. After a moment, the man's eyes slid away, back to the middle distance, back to whatever interior landscape occupied the attention of the people of this place. Kayden kept walking. He passed others. A woman in what might have been professional clothing, standing perfectly still with her hands clasped in front of her, her head slightly bowed, like a doctor waiting for test results that would never arrive. A child, and at the sight of the child, something in Kayden's chest tightened with a nameless violence, though he could not have said why. Sitting in the dirt and running her hands through it in slow, repetitive circles, around and around, finding no meaning in the gesture, but unable to stop making it. An old man with a white beard who turned to watch Kayden pass, with eyes that held something nearly like recognition, nearly like communication. But whatever he was trying to transmit was buried too deep to reach the surface. The agony of this place was the absence of agony. It was the absence of everything, of warmth, of connection, of purpose, of hope. Not the sharp hope that gets crushed and takes your breath away, but even the dull, habitual hope of ordinary life. The assumption that tomorrow would exist and that you would be in it, and that it would contain, however marginally, the possibility of something good. None of that lived here. None of that could survive this air, this light, this vast and patient dark. This is the in-between. Some part of him thought, some part that seemed to know things he couldn't account for. This is where people who weren't bad enough end up. The ones who lived without choosing, without committing, without truly going all the way in either direction, trapped in a nothing that goes on forever. The thought was there and gone, and he could not explain where it had come from. He walked, and as he walked, the first fragment of something surfaced in his mind. Not a memory, exactly. More like the ghost of one. More like the sensation that a memory existed somewhere nearby and was pressing against the inside of his skull from the outside, asking to be let in. He saw, not with his eyes, but with something behind his eyes, a kitchen. His mother's kitchen. Yellow walls and a window that faced a backyard with an oak tree. And morning sunlight doing what morning sunlight does, filling the room with the specific gold of ordinary happiness. He was 12 years old, and he was eating cereal, and his mother was saying something. Talking as she moved around the kitchen the way she always had, her voice a comfort so constant and so embedded in the background of his experience that he had stopped actively hearing it years ago. The way you stop hearing traffic from your bedroom window. He had a mother. He had a childhood. He had a life, somewhere, in some time and place, that felt very far from here. The fragment dissolved. The kitchen went away. The plane extended before him, enormous and dark. And Kayden moved through it with a purposefulness he didn't quite feel, heading toward a far edge, where the darkness seemed to deepen further still, where the shape of the horizon suggested the plane was not actually flat, but sloped, descended, led somewhere further down. He did not want to go further down. He went further down. He heard it before he reached it, a sound that seemed impossible at first, that his mind categorized as industrial, as mechanical, as perhaps some kind of massive HVAC system or highway at a distance. It was only as he drew closer to the edge of the plane, as the ground began to tip downward under his feet, and the passage between the first level and the second opened before him like a wound in the rock. Only then did he understand what he was hearing. Wind. The second level was defined by wind. Not wind in any natural sense. Not the wind of storms, of weather, of the world he knew, which even at its most violent had a logic to it, a direction, a pattern you could read if you were paying attention. This wind was alive in the way that only a few things are alive that shouldn't be. Purposeful, intelligent, malicious in its application. It swept through the massive, cathedral-like space of the second level in a great roaring columns and sheets, and it carried with it everything that had ever been swept up and could not find ground. Debris, the dust, fragments of things he couldn't identify, and people. People tumbling through the air, not falling, tumbling, being carried, being flung and slammed and hurled through the roaring dark by a wind that gave them no rest, no pause, no moment in which to regain their footing or their breath or their bearings. They streamed past in the near distance like leaves in a river, and the sounds they made were not screams. Screaming required more control than this wind allowed. But something raw. Something that was simply the sound of a body being subjected to forces it was never built to withstand. Kayden flattened himself against the wall of the passage he had come through and watched. He watched for a long time. The people in the wind were not being harmed, not in the way that he would have expected hell to harm its occupants. They were not being burned or cut or broken. They were simply being moved, endlessly, without direction or purpose or rest, flung and tumbled and carried and spun and set loose again. The torment was the motion itself. The torment was the relentless, unceasing, purposeless movement, the denial of stillness, of ground, of the simple animal comfort, of having your feet beneath you and knowing where you were. These are the people who were ruled by passion. He thought again, that strange knowing voice surfacing from somewhere, who let what they wanted override what was right, who followed desire wherever it led without regard for where they were going. And so they are moved, forever moved. They wanted so badly, and now they can never stop. He needed to cross this level. He could see that. He could see that the path downward, and always it led downward. Always the geometry of this place funneled toward further depths, as though depth itself were the organizing principle of the universe he had entered. Lay on the far side of this howling, churning space. He waited for a moment when the wind seemed to shift, when the currents reorganized themselves in a pattern that briefly opened a channel of relative calm near the ground, near the wall, and he ran. It was the most terrifying run of his life. The wind tore at him, and he understood immediately that it was not indifferent to him, that it knew he was there, that it reached for him with the greedy, personal attention of something that wanted to add him to its collection. He ran with his body angled forward against the force of it, his arms pulling in close, his eyes burning and streaming with tears that the wind snatched away before they could even complete their journey down his cheeks. Twice the force of it nearly took him off his feet, nearly lifted him into the tumbling, screaming current, and twice he threw himself against the wall and clung there, fingers bloodied on the rough stone until the worst of it passed. He reached the far passage gasping, trembling, gulping air that was only slightly less terrible than the wind he had just escaped. He pressed on, and walking in the relative quiet of the next passage, bent slightly at the waist, still catching his breath. Another fragment surfaced. He was 17. A car, his father's car, a sensible sedan. The kind of car that made no statement except the statement of prudence and responsibility. His father was teaching him to drive in an empty parking lot. And his father was patient. His father was almost impossibly patient in the way that good fathers learn to be, in the way that costs something. And Kayden was at the wheel with the specific combination of terror and exhilaration that belongs to that moment and that moment only. Easy, his father said. Easy. You're not in a hurry. You've got all the time in the world. The fragment closed. The memory left a warmth that the cold of this place immediately went to work on, eating at it, reducing it, but not quite extinguishing it. Not quite. Kayden held onto it as he walked, the way you cup a match against the wind. The passage between the second and third circles was the longest yet. A tunnel that sloped steadily downward, its walls closing in over time until Kayden was moving with his shoulders nearly touching both sides. His head bowed beneath a ceiling that pressed toward him as though the earth itself was trying to squeeze him out, like something that did not belong. The air in the tunnel was warmer than it had been, and the warmth was not a comfort, but an offense. The warmth of decomposition, the warmth of things breaking down at a molecular level, the warmth of rot. He smelled the third circle before he reached it. The smell was enormous. It was physical. It had mass. It had weight. It pressed against his face like a wet cloth and pushed into his nostrils and settled in the back of his throat and refused to leave. It was the smell of everything that had ever gone bad. Every piece of fruit left too long on the counter. Every piece of meat left in a car on a summer afternoon. Every organic thing in the full process of returning to the elements that composed it. It was the smell of a world in the process of ending, slowly, continuously, without completion. He came out of the tunnel into the third circle, and the first thing that hit him was the rain. It was a thick, slow, enormous rain. Not the rain of storms or seasons, but a perpetual, punishing precipitation that fell from a ceiling Kayden could not see through the downpour. It was cold rain, gray rain, rain that had no freshness to it, no cleanliness, none of the quality that rain usually has of renewal and clearing. This rain filthied everything it touched. It fell on the ground, which was already a deep, sucking mud, black and cold and reeking, and mixed with it and deepened its misery. It fell on the figures scattered across this level, because there were figures here, many more than the first circle had held, and they were in a different category of condition than the lost souls of the plane, and it fell on them without mercy and without end. The people of the third circle lay in the mud. That was the thing that made this level unique, that made it distinct from the wind of the second level and the ghostly stillness of the first. These people were in the mud, partly of the mud, and the mud received them with an awful intimacy. They had no freedom of movement, no tumbling through open air. They were held, sunk, embedded in something cold and heavy and disgusting, and the rain came down on them without stopping. And the thing that was being imposed on them was a kind of total sensory wallowing, a forced, endless immersion in the physical reality of excess, of gratification taken too far, of the body having been given everything it asked for until everything it asked for became the only thing it knew. Kayden walked through the edge of this level with the rain coming down on him, soaking through his shirt in minutes, filling his sneakers with cold water, running down his neck and under his collar. The mud pulled at his feet with each step, trying to take his shoes, trying to pull him down into its cold embrace. And he lifted each foot with conscious effort, reminding himself with each step of the mechanics of walking, refusing to think about what it would mean to stop, to fall, to become one of the shapes he could see sinking slowly into the ground around him. He heard them. That was the worst part. They weren't screaming. They were making sounds that were worse than screaming. Sounds of complete, bottomless satisfaction that had somehow become indistinguishable from despair. Sounds of appetite that had consumed itself and yet could not stop reaching for more. The sound of hunger as a fundamental state of being rather than a temporary condition. It was the most deeply human sound he had ever heard, and it was the most deeply inhuman sound he had ever heard. And those two things occupied the same frequency in a way that made the hair on his arms rise under his soaking shirt. He moved through the rain as fast as the mud would allow. He was halfway across when the fragment came. He was 20 years old. A party, a good party, the kind of party that only happens when you are 20 and have not yet learned to be suspicious of your own happiness. Someone's house, someone's parents away for the weekend, the specific alchemy of youth and music and the absence of consequences, or the feeling of the absence of consequences, which is close enough at 20. He was drinking, but not badly. Not yet. He was laughing with people he cared about, people whose faces he could almost see in the fragment, almost resolve into specificity, and he was happy. He was genuinely, warmly, uncomplicated happy. Before, some part of him recognized. This is before. Before what? The fragment didn't say. He pushed on through the rain and the mud, and he made the far passage. And he entered the tunnel that led down to the fourth level with his clothes heavy with water and his shoes squishing with every step and his heart beating the steady, exhausted rhythm of a man who is very much afraid, but has decided, for now, to keep going. The fourth circle was defined by weight. He felt it before he understood it, a heaviness that settled on him as soon as he emerged from the passage and stepped onto the broad, tilted plane of the fourth level. It started in his shoulders, then moved to his chest, then filled his legs with a leaden exhaustion that made each step feel like lifting concrete. It was not physical. His body was not being literally weighted down. There was no external force pressing on him. But it was felt as physical, processed by his nervous system as physical. And the distinction between what was real and what was experienced as real had stopped mattering several levels ago. The landscape of the fourth level was bleak in a specific way. A great circular depression, like a volcanic caldera viewed from the inside, with walls that rose on all sides and a floor that curved down toward a central point. And on this curved floor, moving in two great opposing masses, were people, pushing, straining, bearing enormous invisible burdens, moving toward each other with a slow, grunting, exhausted effort of people who have been doing this for longer than they can remember and will be doing it for longer than they can conceive. They crashed together at the center, not with violence, not with the satisfying collision of opposing forces, but with a kind of grinding, frustrated impact. And then they pushed back, reversed direction, ground their way up the curve and back down again, and met once more, and reversed again, around and around. The weight of what they had accumulated pressing down on each of them. The weight of what they had hoarded or wasted or failed to value while they had the chance to value it. He moved around the edge of this level, keeping to the walls, watching the slow, circular agony of the two great crowds. The sounds they made were not sounds of pain exactly, but of effort so sustained and so unrewarded that it had become its own punishment, had become a kind of noise that was very close to despair, very close to the sound a person makes in the last hour of the last night of a struggle. They can no longer believe they will win. The fragment that came to him here was sharp and bright and unwelcome. He was 23. He had money, not a lot, but some, more than he needed for the moment, more than he needed for the week. And a friend needed some, and he didn't give it. Not because he was cruel, not because he hated his friend, but because the money sat in his account and felt like security, felt like a number that made him feel like more than he was. And giving it away would make the number smaller, and the number made him feel big, and he was not ready to feel small. He told himself he'd help next time. There was no next time that looked exactly like that time, and so there was no help. He stood in the fourth circle with the memory of his friend's face, disappointed, understanding, which was worse than angry. And he felt the weight of it, the actual, physical weight of it, pressing down through his shoulders. He understood this level then. He understood it in the way you understand something when understanding it comes with the particular pain of recognition. He moved on, heavier than he had been, heavier in a way that did not ease. He smelled the river Styx, or whatever it was, whatever this place's approximation of that ancient water was. Long before he saw it, it smelled of stagnation, of water that had not moved in geological time, of all the organic things that sank to the bottom of still water and stayed there, breaking down in slow, silent darkness. The fifth circle was a swamp. It spread across the level in a great, shallow, murky expanse. And the water, if it was water, if it deserved the name, was the color of clay mixed with old blood, thick and slow-moving, and filmed with something on its surface that caught the dim light and threw it back wrong. Dead trees rose from it at irregular intervals, their trunks dark and wet, their bare branches reaching upward in attitudes that seemed, in the borderline sanity of this place, like deliberate gestures of distress. And in the swamp, people fought, not fighting in the sense of opponents facing each other with intent and strategy. Fighting in the sense of pure, unconditioned, uncalculated rage. The kind of anger that has burned away all its specific grievances and become something generic. Something that doesn't need a target because the rage itself is the point now. The rage itself is the only energy left. The rage that was once about something and is now about nothing except continuing. They clawed at each other, and at the water and at the air above them. They went under and came back up and went under again. And the sounds they made were the sounds of people who had been angry for so long that the anger was no longer really emotion, but something more like physiology, more like a bodily function that had gotten stuck in the on position. Just below the surface, he could see others. Still, mostly still, submerged, their shapes barely visible through the opaque water, making slow, bubbling sounds that rose to the surface in bursts of sullen gas. These were the ones whose rage had turned inward, he somehow knew. The ones who had consumed themselves with it, who had directed it at their own lives and relationships and possibilities until there was nothing left to destroy. And so they simply lay in the silt, expressing their anger at nothing, at everything, at the accumulated weight of a life lived at the wrong temperature. Kayden found a path across this level along a narrow causeway of raised ground, a winding finger of land that extended through the swamp in switchbacks that required attention, required careful placement of each foot, required him to be present and deliberate in a way that felt unexpectedly like a small act of resistance against the entropy of this place. He moved along it with his arms slightly out for balance, and the sounds of the swamp rose around him. And twice the causeway dipped below the surface, and he had to wade through the thick, cold, reeking water up to his knees. And both times he felt the hands of the submerged beneath the surface, brushing against his legs, not quite grasping, not quite pulling, but suggesting the possibility. He did not look down. He kept moving. The fragment that came to him in the swamp was one he did not want. He almost pushed it away. But it had a weight to it, a momentum, and it came through before he could stop it. He was 24, and he was in a fight with a woman he loved, had loved, was in the process of deciding whether he still loved, which was a form of its own particular cowardice. And the fight was about something he could no longer remember. Something specific that had become general, had expanded from its original small shape into something that filled the whole room, that filled the whole relationship. And he said things that lived in the gap between technically true and meant to wound. Things that used the information available to him, the specific, intimate information of someone who had been trusted, as weapons. He said things that could not be unsaid, that did not dissolve when the fight ended, that sat in the air of the relationship like a residue, like a stain, like evidence of what was possible from him when he was angry enough. She forgave him. He never quite forgave himself, but he had done it again. He knew that, standing in the fifth circle of hell with the swamp water cooling around his legs. He had done it again, maybe not the same words, but the same act, the same use of intimacy as a weapon, the same casual cruelty of a person who did not fully believe, in the moment of the anger, that the person in front of him was as real as he was. He reached the far bank and climbed out of the water and did not look back. The sixth circle announced itself with light. After the dim, bruised illumination of everything above it, the light of the sixth circle was almost violent in its brightness. Orange and red and gold, the colors of fire, real fire, actual leaping, consuming, brilliant fire. And for half a second, Kayden's exhausted brain processed this as hope, as warmth, as the possibility of something good. For half a second, fire meant a campfire, a hearth, a kitchen stove, a birthday cake. Then he crested the descent into the sixth level and saw the city. It stretched before him in a rough approximation of urban geography, streets and structures, the skeleton of a place people had built and lived in. But every building was a tomb. The structures were tall and narrow and sealed, constructed of dark stone that glowed a deep orange from within, as though fires burned in closed rooms inside every one of them, as though the buildings themselves were furnaces. The streets between them were broad and empty, and lit by the flames escaping through the cracks in the masonry. And the sounds that came from the sealed buildings, the sounds that came through the stone, through the mortar, through every gap and fissure in the construction, were sounds that Kayden would spend a long time trying to find words for and never quite succeed. The people of the sixth circle were inside the tombs, sealed inside with the fire. But they did not burn, or they burned in a way that did not destroy, that did not consume, that simply hurt without relief or conclusion. And what was most terrible about the sixth circle was not the fire or the sealed stone or the sounds coming through the walls. What was most terrible was the understanding that came to him as he moved through the streets of this burning city. An understanding that settled on him with the certainty of revelation. These were the people who had organized their lives around certainty, who had taken the messy, complicated, irreducibly ambiguous experience of being human and tried to reduce it to a system, a set of rules, an ideology that told them exactly who was right and who was wrong, and exactly what they themselves were permitted to do, and exactly what permission that gave them over others. They had committed themselves to the arrogance of perfect clarity in a world built on ambiguity. And they were held in it now, in their certainty, sealed inside it like an oven, with only themselves and their convictions for company, and the heat of their own absolute confidence burning them from the inside without ever quite finishing the job. Kayden walked through those streets quickly, very quickly, keeping to the center of the widest thoroughfares, not looking at the buildings for too long, not listening too carefully to the sounds from inside them. He walked with his eyes forward and his arms tight against his body and his jaw set. And he told himself, in the rhythm of his steps, that he was going to get through this, that there was a way through, that the geometry of this place meant it had to have a bottom, and that the bottom meant a far end, and that the far end meant something, even if he couldn't yet say what. The fragment in the sixth circle was long, more sustained than the others, arriving in sections as he walked. He was 25, and he was at a party with his friends, and they were all doing what they were doing, which was what they always did, which was the ritual of young men who loved each other without quite knowing how to say so, which involved alcohol and noise and velocity, the specific combustion of male friendship and bravado, and the mutual daring that creates its own pressure. He was behind the wheel of a car he was proud of. A 2016 Lexus RC300F Sport, black, quick, and responsive in a way that made him feel powerful in the most adolescent possible sense of the word. And he was talking to someone in the passenger seat and not giving his full attention to the road. And it was fine. It was always fine. He had done this 100 times, and it was always fine. It was always fine until it wasn't. But he didn't know that yet. In the memory, he was 25 and alive. And the night was warm, and the car was beautiful, and his friends were laughing, and the world was the world, ordinary and rich and available to him. The fragment closed. He passed through the 6th circle and descended again. The 7th level was divided. He understood this in the way he had come to understand things in this place, through a combination of direct perception and that uncanny background knowing, into rings, each one a response to a different kind of violence. Violence against others. Violence against oneself. Violence against the natural order of things. The outer ring was a river of blood. It moved slowly, that river, with the unhurried confidence of something that has always been here and will always be here. A deep, dark red that steamed slightly in the cool air. And in it figures stood at varying depths, some at their ankles, some at their waists, some at their chins, some fully submerged, except for the tops of their heads. And the depth of their immersion corresponded to the depth of the violence they had done to others while they were alive. Those who had acted on impulse in a single terrible moment stood at the shallow edge. Those who had made violence a practice, a policy, a pleasure, stood deep. Kayden stood at the edge of the river and looked at the faces of those who were submerged to various depths. And in their expressions, he read, for the first time in this descent, something he recognized as guilt. Not the abstract guilt of people who know they have done wrong, but the specific, intimate guilt of people who have fully understood, at last, what they took from the world by doing what they did. Who have had time, infinite time here, time that stretched beyond any capacity for endurance, to fully feel the weight of what was lost. He crossed the river on a narrow ford, wading to his thighs in a blood-warm thickness that he tried not to think about, not to identify, not to give its actual name. He crossed it with his eyes fixed on the far bank and his mind fixed on nothing, deliberately fixed on nothing, because he was afraid of what would happen if he let his mind go to the places it was beginning to gesture toward. The middle ring was a dead wood. He entered it, and the silence there was the deepest silence he had encountered in this entire journey. A silence that had the texture of something that had chosen silence, that had made peace with silence, but not a good peace, not a peace of acceptance, but a peace of defeat, of surrender, of the kind of quiet that you arrive at when you have used up every other option. The trees of this wood were black and leafless and wrong in the way that all the organic things of this place were wrong. Grown from a soil that had never seen the sun, shaped by pressures that had nothing to do with wind and rain and the turning of seasons. And from them, from the branches, from the trunks, from the deep, tortured knots in the wood, came sounds. Voices trapped in vegetable form, voices that had given up the human shape that carries voices and had been distributed into something large and immovable and rooted. He did not touch the trees. He moved through the wood as quickly as he could and came out on the far side and descended further. The fragment that came to him in the 7th circle came in 2 parts, and the 2 parts together were worse than either would have been alone. The first part, the Lexus on a road at night. A beach town. He could smell the ocean even in this fragment, the clean salt smell of it, the smell that under any other circumstances would have been a joy. And the road was a main road, a commercial street, the kind of street that has restaurants and shops and crosswalks, The kind of street where people exist at night because it's summer and the town is alive and the night is warm. He was driving fast. He knew he was driving too fast, even as the memory replayed. He had known it then. A small voice under the noise of the music and the conversation and the warm haze of too many beers over too many hours. He knew, and the knowing was a small thing compared to the velocity and the pride and the friendship and the night. He was racing. The car beside him, his friend's car, another beautiful machine, another 20-something man at its wheel with the same careful disregard for consequence, ran parallel to him on the two-lane road. And they were both accelerating, both leaning into it, both committed to the specific, stupid joy of the moment. The fragment paused there, at the moment before, and sat. He pushed through the outer ring of the 7th circle, and the blood river ran behind him, and the dead wood was behind him, and he was moving toward the 8th circle and the 9th and the last. And the second part of the fragment was waiting for him at the bottom. The 8th circle was the most elaborate level he had encountered. A vast amphitheater of descending rings, each ring a separate pit, each pit containing its own specific response to a specific kind of dishonesty. He could see it all from the descent into it, laid out below him like an enormous architectural plan. The pits arranged in concentric circles around a central darkness that yawned at the bottom of the amphitheater like a mouth. He moved through the outer rings quickly, not allowing himself to linger, not allowing himself to look too carefully into any of the pits. He saw what was in them in his peripheral vision, and in brief, unwilling direct glances, people wrapped in fire walking in perpetual circles, people immersed in something dark and liquid, surfacing and submerging in a rhythm that looked almost mechanical. People stitched and sutured in configurations that suggested wounds not quite healed over old wounds. Bodies that had been opened and opened again so many times that the margin between interior and exterior had been lost. People who bore burdens that dragged behind them, weights that had the shapes of things once prized and now understood at their actual cost. He moved through the outer rings and into the inner rings. And the further he moved toward the center of the 8th circle, the older everything felt. The more fundamental the wrongness, the more deeply embedded in the structure of things. Fraud was, after all, the specific human crime. The crime that required intelligence, required the ability to model other minds and exploit that modeling. Required the evolution of an organ, built for empathy to be repurposed for its opposite. The animals do not deceive in this way. The deception that fills the 8th circle is uniquely human, born of uniquely human gifts gone wrong in uniquely human ways. Kayden was not innocent of this level. He knew that. He knew it in the general way one knows about oneself when the usual protections have been stripped away. The self-serving stories, the context that softens, the comparisons to people who did worse. And what is left is simply the record, simple and unadorned. He had lied to people, in ways that benefited him, in ways that cost them, not dramatically, not spectacularly, in the ordinary ways of ordinary selfishness, the small deceptions, the convenient omissions, the half-truths deployed at strategic moments, the promises made with insufficient intention to keep them. None of it would make a good story. None of it would seem, to an outside observer, particularly damning. But in this place, stripped of ordinary context, the size of the deceptions stopped mattering. What mattered was the shape of them. What mattered was that he had looked at other people and decided, in those moments, that his needs and comfort and convenience were more important than their right to the truth. He crossed the 8th circle on bridges of stone that arched over the pits. And from below him came sounds he incorporated without examining, because examining them would have required stopping, and stopping would have required accepting this place on its own terms. And that was a thing he was no longer willing to do. Would not do, refused to do, regardless of how much this place insisted on it. Another fragment came. He was back in the beach town, this time earlier in the evening. A bar, a table of friends, the specific ease of a group of people who have known each other long enough to be comfortable in their silences. He was having a good time. He was having a genuinely good time. And he was drinking. And he knew. The fragment showed this to him with a particular clarity, showed him the moment of knowing, isolated it, held it up to the light. He knew that he had had enough. That the line he always told himself he would observe had been crossed some time ago. And that what he was doing now was the thing he always did after that crossing, which was to stop counting and stop thinking and stop being the person who knew better and simply be the person who was present in the moment, who was having a good time, who was not going to let the abstract responsibility of sobriety interrupt the concrete pleasure of the night. He drove anyway. The fragment stopped there. He crossed the 8th circle and descended to the last level. And the second part of the fragment was there, as he had known it would be, waiting for him in the deepest cold at the bottom of the world. The cold hit him on the stairs down to the 9th circle like a physical blow. A cold so profound, it seemed to attack the concept of warmth itself, to reach back through time and undo every warm thing that had ever existed. His breath came out in great white clouds. His fingers, within seconds, lost sensation. The skin of his face felt as though it was tightening, contracting, pulling back from a cold that wanted to compress him, to reduce him to something smaller and harder and less. The 9th circle was ice. A vast, flat plain of it, dark, blue-gray, deep and ancient and almost translucent. And in the ice, embedded at various depths, people. Frozen, not dead. Never death in this place. Never the mercy of finality. But frozen. Their positions fixed, their expressions fixed. The last thing they had felt or thought or experienced, held in permanent suspension in the ice that enclosed them. Those who had betrayed the people who had trusted them most. Those who had taken the specific, intimate knowledge that love and friendship and family create and used it to do damage. The worst kind of damage. The premeditated kind. The kind where you look at someone who has opened themselves to you and you decide, in full possession of yourself, to use that opening against them. Kayden walked across the ice carefully, because it was slick and because his feet had lost sensation and because the wind that moved across the surface of this level was the same wind that had carried the souls of the 2nd circle, but concentrated here, focused, given the specific sharp edge of the cold. He walked carefully, and he looked straight ahead, and he tried very hard not to look down through the translucent surface at the frozen faces beneath him. He looked down. He couldn't help it. He looked down, and the faces looked back, and they were human, undeniably, helplessly human. And their expressions were fixed at the precise moment of their worst realization, the moment when what they had done had fully arrived in their consciousness. Not guilt before the fact, not guilt during, guilt after, and specifically the guilt of people who could not deceive themselves anymore, who had been given the long, cold silence of eternity in which to understand exactly what they had been. He was almost across. He was almost across, and then the fragment came. The last fragment. The complete one. The one he had been approaching all along, through all these levels, through all this dark, through all this cold and fire and mud and wind and blood and ice. The one that the others had been circling, the one that the others were parts of, the center around which everything else had been orbiting. He was driving. Dark outside, but not late, not dangerous dark, just summer night dark, the warm dark that beach towns have in August, with the restaurant lights and the bar signs and the people moving along the sidewalks in summer clothes, the parents and the couples and the teenagers and the families on vacation. He was in the Lexus, and it was moving faster than it should have been, and he knew that. He knew it somewhere. But the music was loud, and his friend in the other car was keeping pace beside him. And there was a red light ahead that turned green just as they approached it. And they both accelerated through it. Both leaning in, both committed. He saw the crosswalk. He saw it. Not too late. Not too late. There was time. There was still time. He was sure there was still time. But the car was moving fast, too fast, faster than he had let himself fully acknowledge. And he hit the brakes, and the car began to respond, but not fast enough, not nearly fast enough. And his eyes went to the crosswalk, and he saw them. A woman, a child. The woman had dark hair and was wearing a pale yellow summer dress, and she had the child's hand in hers. And they were crossing, and the crosswalk signal said, "Walk." And they were in their rights. They were where they were supposed to be. They were in the protected space of the law and of ordinary human trust and the ordinary rules of a world in which people were supposed to stop at crosswalks. And Kayden was not stopping. He was trying. He had committed to trying. His whole body was trying. But the physics of it were what the physics of it were. And the physics did not negotiate. He swerved. It was the reflexive, animal swerve of a driver trying to do the right thing at the last possible moment. And it was not enough. The right front of the car, and even now, even in the memory, his mind tried to skate past the next part, tried to find ways to not be present for the next part, connected with the woman and with the child at the same moment, or nearly the same moment, and the impact was everything that impacts are, which is total and immediate and impossible to take back. And then the car was off the road, and the tree was in the headlights, and the airbag was in his face. And then there was nothing. And then, a different scene. The screaming of people on the sidewalk. Screaming that was not like any sound he had heard before. The specific, particular screaming of witnesses. People who had been in the middle of ordinary moments, who had been on their way to dinner or coming back from the beach or just existing in the warm summer night, who had seen something that permanently altered the world for them, that divided their lives into a before and an after. And the after was the one they were in now, the one that had screaming in it. He sat in the wreckage of the Lexus with the airbag deflating around him, and he was not dead. Not dead, barely hurt, saved by physics and the angle of the tree, and whatever indifferent cosmic principle decides who survives and who doesn't on any given night. And he looked out through the cracked windshield at the crosswalk, and he understood immediately and completely, and with a clarity that was the worst thing he had ever experienced, what he had done. And then the courtroom. The fragment advanced, flashed forward in the way of dreams, condensing months into moments. He was at a table, and there were lawyers, and the room smelled of carpet cleaner and that particular institutional neutrality of government buildings. And across the room were people. Family members, he understood. Family of the woman in the yellow dress and the child whose hand she had been holding, whose faces he was not able to look at directly because their grief was a thing that had physical dimension, that occupied space, that pressed against him even from across a room. The verdict came. Guilty on both counts. Vehicular manslaughter twice. He heard the word and felt it settle into him with a particular, permanent weight. Felt it find its level in him the way water finds its level, naturally, inevitably, in compliance with the laws that govern such things. And then the judge spoke. And what the judge said was this: "Mr. Kayden, you have been convicted of 2 counts of vehicular manslaughter in the deaths of Sarah Chen, age 31, and Lily Chen, aged 4. As is your right under the amended Correctional Sentencing Act of 2031. You have been offered a choice between 2 forms of sentencing. You may choose 40 years to life with the possibility of parole at 20 to be served at a state correctional facility. Or you may choose the neural penance protocol. 15 minutes of administered corrective experience via direct neural interface, after which you will be subject to a 5-year supervised probationary period and mandatory community service. The choice is yours. The law requires that I inform you that the neural penance protocol is considered by this court and by the medical community to be fully safe from a physiological standpoint. The law also requires that I inform you that 23% of individuals who have undergone this protocol have reported that they would have chosen incarceration had they understood in advance the nature of the experience. 23%. He had heard the statistic and discounted it. He was 26 years old and afraid of prisons, and the 15 minutes had seemed, when he said yes, like a bargain, like the obvious choice, like a clear head that could not be clearer. 15 minutes of something terrible versus the years, the decades, the entire middle arc of his life forfeit in a cage. He had said yes. He had nodded at his attorney and turned to the judge and said yes. The fragment closed. The ice was beneath him and above him and around him, and Kayden stood in the deepest, darkest place he had ever been or would ever be, at the absolute bottom of everything. And he finally understood where he was. He understood what this was. He understood all of it, the levels, the descent, the specific tailor-made architecture of each torment, the memories arriving in fragments as he went deeper, the way the suffering in each circle corresponded to something in him, something he had carried and not looked at, some version of the people in each level that he had, in his own way, in his own modest and ordinary degree, been. He stood on the ice, at the center of everything, and he understood. And the understanding was, paradoxically, the thing that started the ice cracking. He did not ascend in any heroic sense. He did not rise. There was no upward journey through the levels he had descended, no second traversal of wind and rain and blood, no redemptive reversal of the path. What happened instead was this. The ice cracked beneath him, and he fell, downward, which in this context meant through, which in this context meant out. And the fall was long and dark and total, and it was the most terrifying thing that had happened to him since he had arrived in this place. But it was different from the terror that had preceded it. The terror that had preceded it was the terror of encountering something from the outside, something alien and overwhelming that was acting on him, that was happening to him. This terror was something he was moving through, not passive, not a victim of it. Moving through it with the specific, hard-won agency of someone who has reached the center of the worst thing and found there the one thing that makes it navigable. Understanding, not absolution, not forgiveness, not yet, Those would need to come from others, from people he had wronged in ways both specific and general, and he could not give them to himself. But understanding the shape of it, the full, undefended shape of what he had done and who he had been in the doing of it, held in his mind without flinching, without the protective architecture of rationalization, without the comfortable middle distance that normally exists between a person and their worst acts. He had driven drunk. He had made a choice. He had made many choices over many nights that had ended safely, and the safety of those nights had built in him a confidence that amounted to an assumption that safety would continue, that the disproportion between risk and consequence that had always spared him would continue to spare him, that the universe would continue to absorb his poor decisions without presenting him with the bill. The universe had presented him with the bill. Sarah Chen, 31 years old. Lily Chen, 4 years old. A mother and a daughter in a yellow dress and small sneakers on a crosswalk on a summer night, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing in exactly the place they were supposed to be, protected by every ordinary human agreement about how the world was supposed to work. He had ended them. He fell through the dark at the bottom of everything, holding this, and the holding of it was a form of penance that the designed torments of 9 circles had not quite achieved, because those torments had been applied to him from outside, had been things that happened to him. And this was something he was doing himself, voluntarily, in the full possession of his faculties, in the knowledge of what it cost. He held it. He kept holding it. The dark held him. The first thing he was aware of was a ceiling. White, institutional, lit by fluorescent lights that were slightly too bright, that had the aggressive clinical brightness of spaces that were designed for function rather than comfort, for observation rather than rest. The second thing he was aware of was sound. Voices, multiple voices, talking over and around each other, talking in the brisk, efficient shorthand of people who had things to do and were doing them. He heard medical terminology, numbers, levels, readouts. He heard the specific cadence of instructions being given and acknowledged. He heard, beneath all of that, a sound that was trying to be something other than what it was. A sound that wanted to be professional, but was not entirely succeeding. Grief, barely contained, barely managed. Sitting at the edges of someone's voice like water at the edges of a levee. The third thing he was aware of was pain. Not the pain of this place, not the cold and the wind and the weight of the levels, but a different pain. A small and specific and human pain, the pain of a body that had been lying still too long, of joints complaining, of muscles asking to be moved, the small pain of ordinary physical existence. He was in a body. He was in his body. He opened his eyes. The fluorescent ceiling, the white walls of a room that was a medical room, that had the organized clutter of medical spaces, equipment on wheeled stands, monitors with green and blue readouts, IV lines running to his left arm. He was in a bed, in a hospital gown. He was alive. He was here. He was back. He turned his head to the right, and what he saw rearranged everything. The room was full of people, and most of them should not have been there. This was not an ordinary hospital room with family gathered for an ordinary medical event. The people in this room were of 2 distinct categories, and the categories sat apart from each other with a careful, tense distance. The distance of people who had been required to share space they would not have chosen to share, who were maintaining a deliberate, effortful civility in conditions that made civility almost impossible. On one side of the room, near the door, stood two correctional officers in the gray and black uniforms he recognized from before, from the courthouse, from the world of the real, the world of consequences, the world that had brought him here. They stood with the comfortable authority of people accustomed to waiting, with the patient bureaucratic readiness of men who had several more items on their list for the day. Near the window, in a small cluster that held itself together the way wounded things hold together, for warmth, for the physics of mutual survival, were four people he did not know by name, but knew immediately by presence. Two were older, in their 60s, a man and a woman who looked enough alike to be siblings and who had the specific exhaustion of people who had been carrying grief as their primary occupation for months. Behind them, a younger man, 30s, with the kind of careful stillness that comes from deciding not to show what is happening underneath, and a woman about his own age who was not being careful at all, who was looking at him with an expression that contained everything. Grief, rage, loss, and something harder and more complicated underneath all of those. Something she had not yet given a name to that might, in a very long time, and with a very great deal of work, turn into something other than pure hatred. The family, Sarah Chen's family, and Lily Chen's. He knew it with absolute certainty, with the certainty of the knowing he had carried through all 9 levels of this descent. The knowing that his own memory had assembled piece by piece in fragments as he went deeper and deeper into the worst of what he had done. He opened his mouth, and something came out of him that was not language. It was the scream of a man coming back from a place that should have no return from. A sound that came from somewhere in the chest that did not normally make sounds. That came from the compressed space where guilt and grief and terror and relief all existed in violent proximity. That was in one register the sound of a man who has just emerged from an eternity of suffering and is expressing the simple fact of survival. And in another register was something more specific, more directed, more human. I know what I did. I know what I took. I know. The scream went on for a moment that seemed, to the people in the room, very long. The monitors spiked. One of the correctional officers moved forward reflexively and then stopped. The doctor, a thin woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, who had been the one talking to the officers when he came back, moved quickly to the bedside and put her hand on his arm and said something he didn't immediately hear. Something about vital signs and breathing, something clinical and calm. And then the scream ended, and in the place it left behind was a silence of the most human possible kind. Imperfect, full of residue, full of the traces of everything that had produced it. He was sobbing. He was shaking with it, his whole body racked in a way he could not control and did not try to control. The sobs coming from somewhere deep and central, from whatever place it is in the architecture of a person where the weight of things is actually held, finally releasing a load that had been stored there since a summer night on a beach town road, when physics and alcohol and pride and a moment of terrible inattention had conspired to destroy 2 lives that had been entirely innocent and entirely real. He was sobbing, and he was, underneath the sobbing, in a state that he would later describe to the therapist assigned to him as the most frightened and the most grateful he had ever felt simultaneously. Frightened because the memories were all still there. All of it. Every level of descent, every specific horror. every fragment of his own history assembled into a self-portrait he had not previously been willing to sit for. And grateful because this was a room with a white ceiling and fluorescent lights. And he was in a body that ached with the small, ordinary aches of the living. And that was a thing he understood now in a way he had not understood it before, had never been capable of understanding it before, had needed this particular journey to understand. He was alive. He was here. He had not been destroyed. He was not, yet not nearly. He was not naive about this. He was not forgiven. He was not absolved. The weight of what he had done was not lighter than it had been before the protocol. If anything, it was heavier, more specific, more vivid, more permanently installed in his consciousness than it would have been if he had spent any number of years in a prison cell being punished in conventional ways. The technology had ensured that. The technology had done its work with extraordinary precision. But he was here. He had the chance, not the certainty, not the right, just the chance, to carry this forward, to live in the weight of it and to do something with the weight, to transmute it through action, through the long, unremarkable daily work of actually trying, of actually being something different from what he had been. Not because it would earn him anything, not because it would bring anyone back, but because it was the only thing left to do, the only thing left. He became aware, gradually, of other things in the room. The doctor was speaking to the correctional officers, and her voice, which had been professionally calm a moment ago, had taken on an edge that surprised him. "I need another minute," she was saying. "He just came back from a full-depth session. You can't expect—" "We're aware of the protocol, Doctor." The officer's voice was not unkind, but it was pressed for time. "We've got 3 more today. The courts have been backed up since the new sentencing guidelines. If you could just clear him medically, we'll get out of your hair." 3 more today, Kayden thought. And the thought lodged in him with a strange, multi-directional force. 3 more people who had said yes to the 15 minutes. 3 more people who had weighed the arithmetic the way he had seen it the way he had not understood, could not have understood, because understanding was the thing the 15 minutes gave you. What they were saying yes to. 23%. That was the number the judge had cited. 23% of people who had undergone the neural penance protocol reported afterward that they would have chosen incarceration instead. He had been in the 77%. He had been confident, breezy about it, almost. 15 minutes, he had thought. I can do 15 minutes. The 15 minutes were still happening. In 15 minutes, he had lived. He had experienced. He had been immersed in something his nervous system had encoded as lived experience and could not distinguish from lived experience. What felt like decades. What the designers of the protocol called a subjective eternity. The technical specifications that his lawyers had walked him through, briefly, dispassionately, had described it as a minimum subjective duration of 80 to 100 years, expandable based on the severity of the offense and the depth of intervention required for a complete moral reckoning. He did not know how long it had been for him. He had no way of counting. He had lost count somewhere in the 2nd circle, had lost even the desire to count sometime around the 4th, had stopped thinking of himself as a person for whom time had useful meaning somewhere in the deep levels. He had simply been in it, and in it, and in it, and in it. And now he was here. He was here, and he was not the person who had gotten into the Lexus. Not because the intervening experience had magically transformed him. not because suffering, by itself, makes people better. It demonstrably did not. The history of the world was fairly clear on this point. Suffering makes some people better and breaks others, and most people it does neither cleanly. It leaves them complicated and damaged, and in possession of something they can choose what to do with. He was not the person who had gotten into the Lexus, because he knew, now, in a way he had not known before, what it meant to know something. What it meant to really know it. He had known, in the abstract, that drunk driving was dangerous. He had known, in the abstract, that Sarah Chen and Lily Chen were people. Real people, with families who loved them, with lives that had weight and content and meaning, with futures that had been full of specific, ordinary possibility. He had known all of this in the abstract. He had not known it in the way he knew it now. Now it was not abstract. Now it was as concrete as anything that had ever happened to him. More concrete than most things, more real than the years before the night on the road, more present in his nervous system than any experience his actual physical life had contained. Because the protocol had done the one thing that ordinary consequences, fines, incarceration, social censure, the legal process, could not do. It had made him feel the reality of what he had taken, had made him carry it, had walked him through the version of himself that had made it possible, and shown him every choice in the chain, every small accommodation to his own convenience over someone else's welfare. Every time he had decided that the rules were for other people, that the consequences were for other people, that other people were, in some essential way, that he had never articulated, but had always acted on, less real than he was. The protocol had corrected that misapprehension. The doctor had his wrist now, taking his pulse manually, in addition to whatever the monitors were telling her. And she was looking at him with the specific, careful neutrality of someone who had done this many times, and had learned to keep their own response to it behind a professional partition, but not entirely successfully. He could see it at the edges of her expression. The things she was trying not to show. The response of one human being to another human being in a condition that warranted it. "How are you doing?" she asked. It was, given the circumstances, a nearly impossible question. It was also, he understood, not entirely a medical question. She was asking something else. She was asking the question you ask someone who has just come back from somewhere you can't follow them, asking if they have come back whole, asking if the journey has broken something essential or has instead broken something that needed to be broken. He thought about the question honestly, in the new way he had been given for thinking about things. "Alive," he said. She nodded once and wrote something on the chart. The family, Sarah Chen's family, Lily Chen's family, had not spoken. The older man, the one he had identified as a parent, was looking at him with an expression that had gone through several visible iterations in the last few minutes, that had started at something hard and bright and vengeful, and had moved, incrementally, into something more complicated, something less certain. The older woman, the mother or aunt, had her hand pressed to her mouth and was looking away. The younger man was looking at his phone. The young woman who had been looking at him with open hatred was still looking at him, but the expression had shifted, fractionally, reluctantly, almost against her will. He looked at her. He held her gaze. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. There was nothing he had a right to say to any of them. Nothing that would not be, in some degree, a further imposition, a further making of himself the center of a story that was not his to center. He could see them. really see them in a way he had not been capable of before, as people who had had something taken from them that could not be replaced, who were here because the court had given them the option to witness the protocol, had offered it as a small thing, a symbolic gesture. The chance to watch the person who had done this receive something that looked like justice. And he understood why they had come. And he did not feel the right to have any reaction to their presence other than acknowledgement. He looked at the young woman. She was, he estimated, late 20s, the same generation as him, though she had aged in the way that people age when grief has been their primary occupation, the way it creates a seriousness around the eyes, a kind of gravity that others their age don't yet carry. She might have been a sister. She might have been a cousin. She might have been a close friend of Sarah's. One of those friendships so old and deep they might as well be family. He didn't know. He might never know. He looked at her, and what he tried to put in his eyes. Not apology, because apology was too small and also too convenient. Apology was something that could be given and received and check a box. What he tried to put in his eyes was the simple, undefended fact of, I see you. I see what I took. I am not going to look away from it. She looked back at him for a long moment. Then she looked away. It was not forgiveness. It was nowhere close to forgiveness. Forgiveness was a thing that existed on a time scale he had not yet earned the right to think about. But it was something. It was the first exchange between two people in this room as people, rather than as roles, perpetrator and victim, guilty and grieving. And it was, given everything, more than he deserved. Okay, the officer said from near the door, the word carrying the gentle but immovable impatience of an institution that ran on schedules. Dr. Vasquez, if we could... One moment, she said. And she said it in a way that closed the subject. She bent slightly toward Kayden and spoke in a lower voice, the voice you use when you are saying something that is for one person and not for the room. There is a support program, she said, for individuals who have completed the protocol. Counseling, community service placement, supervised engagement with victim support organizations. If the families consent, it's not mandatory, it's an option. She paused. Most people take it. He thought about what he had seen in the ninth circle. He thought about the frozen faces in the ice, the faces fixed at their worst moment, at the moment of full understanding, held there in the cold with the understanding intact and no means of acting on it. Understanding without the capacity to act is just its own form of hell. I want to take it, he said. His voice was rough, abraded, a voice that had been through things voices were not meant to go through. But it was his voice, still his, recognizably, irrevocably his. Dr. Vasquez wrote something on the chart. From across the room, one of the older people, the woman with her hand still at her mouth, made a sound. It was a small sound, involuntary, the kind of sound a body makes when it is managing something almost too large to manage. She did not look at him, but the sound had been there, and it was human, and in this room, on this morning, human sounds were the only currency that mattered. All right, the officer said, more gently this time. We do need to move. Kayden nodded. He began the process of sitting up, of returning to the verticality of the living, and the room moved around him in the way rooms move around people who are coming back to themselves from a distance. He thought of the two remaining people in the corridor, waiting for their 15 minutes. He did not know what they had done. He did not know their crimes, their histories, the specific machinery of the choices that had brought them here. But he knew they were about to say yes to something they did not understand, and he could not tell them. There was no way to tell them. The law expressly prohibited disclosure of specific protocol experiences. And even if there had been a way, the language for it would have failed him. The language was not adequate to it. The language was built for the world above, and this was something from below the world above. He could not tell them what they were about to carry. He could only exist as a piece of evidence that you could come back from it, that something was waiting for you at the end of it, something different from what you had been. He sat up, and his feet found the floor, and the floor was a hospital floor. Cool linoleum, utterly ordinary, utterly real. And he pressed his feet against it and felt the specific, enormous relief of ground. Just ground. Just the ordinary, unremarkable, life-sustaining fact of ground beneath his feet. Outside the window, the world went on. He could hear it, traffic, someone's radio, the ambient hum of a city proceeding through a morning as cities do damas, without reference to the extraordinary events occurring in the hospital rooms where technology reached down into brains and showed people what they were, what they had done, what the world looked like from every direction except the comfortable one. Kayden looked at the window for a moment. Then he looked back at the room, at the doctor writing in her chart, at the officers consulting their tablets, at the family of two people who were not in this room and would never be in this room again, standing in the particular gravity field of their grief. He looked at all of it. He held all of it. He breathed. For the first time in his life, that was enough.